the next few minutes we're going to spend together, we're going to be talking about a hidden issue. It's an issue that's happening in all of our communities. It's happening on our playgrounds, in our neighborhoods, in our schools. It's happening in our businesses, in factories, in agricultural industries, right in our community and all across the world. The issue that we're going to be leaning in and talking about is human trafficking and modern day slavery. You know, a lot of times we see things one way and it looks maybe even beautiful and enticing. But if we can see behind it, we actually see that it's something much different. And so today, that's what we're going to be discussing, is ways to really recognize and understand what human trafficking is right in our own communities. My name is Jenny Sorey, and I'm the founder and executive director of Hub of Hope. At Hub of Hope, our mission is to bring healing and opportunities to victims of human trafficking and to provide prevention and education to our communities. And so over the next few minutes, we're going to be leaning into a discussion about defining human trafficking. How do we actually know how to recognize human trafficking right in our own communities? What are the tactics of traffickers in our community? Could we actually recognize signs of trafficking? There are markers and identifiers that we can be watchful for in our friends, in our family, in our community members, those people that are closest to us in our circle of influence. We're also going to learn that once we find out, maybe we see a marker or identifier, how could we report that? Who do we report that to? And how do we seek assistance if we actually see that in our own lives? We're also going to be addressing the demand, and that's going to be an important conversation because the demand is what keeps trafficking going. That's the cyclical nature of trafficking. So we're going to be discussing that. And then by the end of our discussion, you might be wondering, is there something that I could actually do to combat human trafficking, to prevent human trafficking from happening in my own life, in my friends and my family and my community and across the globe? So thank you for joining us, and let's dive in. So the issue we're talking about today is human trafficking. And so let's define that, because there's a lot of myths around what human trafficking is. So from a definition standpoint, we got our first definition of human trafficking in the year 2000 through what we call the Trafficking of Victims Protection Act. So we call that the TVPA 2000. And in that we got a long definition that we can dive into when we have more time. But for today, let's define human trafficking as the commercial trade of human beings for profit. What that means is if I had someone that you wanted to use for sex or labor, I would give that person over to you for your use, and in exchange for that, I, as the trafficker, would receive something of value. So a lot of times our mind goes straight to money, which money is exchanged, but other things of value, drugs, certain items that are valuable, can also be exchanged for the use of that human being. We can also define human trafficking in a much simpler definition by saying that human trafficking is people selling people. That is what human trafficking is. Another way that we define human trafficking is through what we call the AMP model. So that's AMP, and that stands for action, means, and purpose. And so the action of trafficking is also where some myths come into play, because a lot of people want to believe that there's always a border involved, that it happens in another country, that you have to transfer or transport someone. But when we think about the action of trafficking, it is defined as recruitment, transfer, transportation, harboring, or the receipt of a person. And so what that means is that one of those individually could be the action of trafficking. Sometimes it is transportation or harboring. Sometimes you do have people moving from one place to the other, but it can also be the recruitment of someone and the receipt of someone. And a lot of times in that action, and what we see a lot at Hub of Hope, is someone who has a great need, a trafficker sees that, so they will recruit that individual. And we'll talk about that more here in just a moment. They will make them believe that they are a trustworthy person, And over time, through this grooming process, building that trust, that individual becomes trafficked. And that trafficker then will give them over, and someone will receive them and exploit them through sex or labor. So recruitment and receipt of persons could be the action of trafficking solely. But again, transfer, transportation, harboring, all of those can take place as well. And then the means of trafficking. So that's the M in our AMP model. The means of trafficking is always going to be through force, fraud, and or coercion. And so what is force? Force is the abuse of power. And when I say power, a lot of people think about like strength, like physically through violence or whatever that means is, that abuse of power. And does that happen? Yes, we do see that happening. But people can also abuse their power of position. And so we see force, that abuse of power in people's positions of authority. So maybe it's a boss or someone in a family or in some type of a community organization. And so abuse of power is force. Fraud is a lie. Lots of empty promises are made from traffickers. Promises of love and attention and affection. Promises of a really good paying, dignified job. But when tides turn, we actually see that it is a lie, and that is not at all what the trafficker actually was going to come through with in that promise. And then we also see coercion. And so coercion is really a threat. And so a lot of times an individual who has been groomed, brought into trafficking through force, through fraud, also has has to deal with coercion. And so if they say, I'm not gonna do these things that you're telling me to do, you promised me a good, dignified, paying job, and you're asking me to do this instead. Maybe it's forced prostitution, or maybe it's a job where they're actually not getting paid for the labor that they are doing. And so that trafficker will say, if you don't do this, and they will throw out a threat. I will post photos of you that we took in intimate moments, or I will actually hurt someone in your family or hurt you. And so force, fraud, and or coercion is how we see the means of trafficking. That's how that trafficker keeps really a grasp, that control, manipulates that victim. And then the purpose of trafficking is always for sex trafficking, sometimes forced prostitution we call that, or for labor trafficking, for sex or for labor. So that's the AMP model. There's always an action of trafficking, there's always a means of trafficking, and there's always a purpose of trafficking. And so when we also think about trafficking, and as we're defining that, we have to remember that trafficking is really a criminal industry. And so when we say industry, it means that it makes bank, it makes money, right? And so oftentimes I throw out, how much do you believe the human trafficking industry brings in a year globally across the world? You might be thinking of a few things right now. Some people throw out millions, some people throw out 10 billion, something like that. But what I want to tell you is that it's estimated that across the globe, the human trafficking industry brings in $150 billion every year. So I don't really know what $150 billion looks like. I've never seen that in my life. But to help us kind of visualize and picture what that is, if we were to take the annual profits, what these industries bring in a year, and combine them, it would barely reach $150 billion. So if we were to look at the annual profits of Nike, Google, and Starbucks, three known industries that make a lot of money, if we combine their profits for the year, it would barely touch $150 billion. And so when we're talking about human trafficking, we have to understand that it is profitable because it's an industry, and it's also criminal. And so as we think about human trafficking, these are some of the things to kind of remember, to debunk myths. It doesn't just happen overseas. It happens right in our own communities here in the United States as well. It is a criminal industry, and there are things that we can do to combat that. So how does the person actually become trafficked? What does that look like? So let's talk about what we call the tactics of traffickers. And so During this time, the trafficker will really target a victim. And so that could be somebody who actually peruses social media. And so a trafficker might look at different posts that people are posting on maybe Instagram or Facebook, for example. And so when we post things, we have to be very careful about showing vulnerability. We're all vulnerable in one way or the other, but when we post things, even about where we're located and our name, maybe we feel lonely or we want to have a friend or a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Traffickers watch for those things. They'll target victims also who maybe have some type of vulnerability where they don't have job security. They don't have good family relationships or friend groups. And so traffickers will look for that and they will target their victim. That's the first thing that happens. So the next phase is deception. And so traffickers are very vague about their profession. We've heard lots of stories of where a trafficker says, I am a record producer, or my business allows me to travel all over the world. They'll make their profession look very, very enticing, like something you would want to be a part of. And so you can't really know, especially on social media, online, you can't really know who that person is. So sometimes they will be deceptive in also saying that they are young, but they might actually be much older than what they're really coming off as on social media. Then there will be this phase of grooming. And so when they've established a connection with this victim that they have sought out, they will begin filling that individual with lots of lies. It's this grooming technique. It's promises, again, of love and attention and affection, or the promise of a good paying, decent job. They will promise and they will give them nice items like expensive things, take individuals out to eat at nice places, buy very expensive gifts. And so this is happening in this grooming process. And so maybe the trafficker met this victim online, but now is meeting with them in person. And a lot of times that victim of trafficking doesn't even recognize or realize the position that he or she is in. They will believe they're in a relationship or a friendship with this individual. So that grooming process happens where the trafficker is building trust with that victim. And the trafficker will also feel a need. And so when we talk about those vulnerabilities very publicly, that we don't have a job, we don't have friends, that there is, we don't have a lot of support, a trafficker will come in and say, I will be that for you. And if you remember when I was talking about the means of trafficking, that's where we see fraud happening. Lots of exaggerated promises, lots of lies that happen during that time. And then a phase of isolation. And so the trafficker will actually make that person that they have targeted as a victim believe that they do not have a good support system in their family or their friend groups or at the job that they consistently have or currently have. Maybe that, school isn't something that they really need because they're going to fill that need. Again, lots of lies happen during that time. And so they will begin isolating that person from their true trusted support group. So we see that phase of isolation happening. And they make that relationship so enticing. So many of the friends that we work with have shared stories of truly believing that they were in a relationship with their trafficker. That's what we call a boyfriend or girlfriend pimp. That trafficker actually makes them believe that they are going to love them forever and give them all the things that they need. But when tides turn, that person understands really that this trafficker did not mean good, but actually meant harm for them. And so they make a lot of empty promises, a lot of opportunities to make a person believe that that relationship is truly worthy, and it's not. And then the trafficker will do everything he or she can to maintain control. And so that could be through threats or violence. They can be very manipulative, very deceptive. And so we see a combination of those things happening. Let me tell you just a quick story. So there was a young girl, and she was in high school. She was in that phase of just really thinking, I'm going to be gone in just a few years from high school. And she began really searching for opportunities to be able to investigate what that's going to look like on her own. And she started, looking on social media and dating apps and making connections with individuals. And somebody actually told her that she knew someone who could help them actually leave home and go to another state and actually move into a modeling profession. So they believed that. They believed that advertisement. And these two girls went with this trafficker. They did not know it at the time. That's who it was. And he drove them to another state. And along the way, they would stop at truck stops and he actually forced them into prostitution at those truck stops along the way. Thankfully for them, their story ended very well because they were able to call someone and get assistance, and they actually had rescue from that situation. But it's because they believed the lies of a trafficker online in a solicitive way. So we just have to be so careful about the things that we read and believe online. But it could also happen in person as well. We just see the online presence of traffickers in their grooming process so heavy right now. That's one of the number one ways the traffickers are getting to victims. And so what are some of the ways that in your community, we talk a lot about recognizing the signs of trafficking. So what are some of the markers and identifiers? So maybe you're watching this and some of these things are ringing true for you yourself. Or maybe you're seeing this in friend groups or in the community, maybe in your workplace, different parts of the community. So what are some of the things that we could watch for? Let me state that when I talk about markers and identifiers, just because somebody is showing signs that I might talk about does not necessarily mean that they are a victim of human trafficking. But if 2 or 3 or 4 of these things are present, then you might want to lean into that. And then I will talk to you about how to report those things as well. And so some of the things that we say to look for are signs of physical abuse, because great violence is used in the tactics of traffickers oftentimes. And so as we think about looking for physical signs of abuse, a victim of trafficking often avoids eye contact with other individuals. She or he allows someone who has power, that abuse of power, remember, over them to speak for that individual. So oftentimes he or she doesn't use her own voice, but the trafficker will speak for her. They don't have possessions really of any value a lot of times. And so that trafficker is holding all of those for them. They also don't have in possession their own documentation. And so thinking about driver's license or ID, even deeper like birth certificates and social security cards, oftentimes they can't give those things over because their trafficker is holding those. That's a means of control and manipulation there. We also think about tattoos and branding. I always say, when we think about branding, like with a branding iron, what do we think about? I mean, my brain goes to branding cattle. And what does that do? That shows ownership. So if you think about someone who's a rancher, they're going to brand all of their cattle with their brand saying, I own these. So if they're away from me at any moment, somebody can look at that and know that that belongs to me as the rancher. It's the same thing in trafficking. So oftentimes traffickers will tattoo or brand a name or a symbol that signifies I own this individual. And so we watch for that. We watch for particular tattoos and branding as well. And just if you know someone within your circle of influence, if they become very disconnected, all of a sudden they're not reaching out to you, you see them maybe even running away or disconnecting from family or friends, that also might be a really big sign. Drug use, any type of substance abuse, that also could be a sign. Over-sexualized behaviors in the way somebody talks or the way that somebody dresses. And if they talk about having a huge debt or all of a sudden they're stacking a bunch of cash, that could also be a sign. And I'm not saying these things so that you might be at Walmart or whatever type of grocery store you shop at or out in the community at a park, and you could look across the parking lot or look across the park and say, that might be somebody who is being trafficked. You're not probably going to be able to use these types of signs in that environment, but if you think about who is your circle of influence, your friends, the people that you work with, the people that you are in community with, that's where you're going to most likely be able to use some of these markers and identifiers in your own life and make a difference, maybe in the life of somebody else who's being trafficked, who's just looking for that opportunity to be able to get out of the life, to be able to get out of the game, as we call it in sex trafficking. So let's say that you recognize a marker or identifier, a sign of trafficking. People say, what in the world would I do with that? So there are different ways to report. And one of the things that I want to say is that if it is a minor, if it's somebody under the age of 18, we say that you can call the child abuse hotline. And so we will give you that number that you can actually see on your screen. It's 1-800-482-5964. But we also want to make sure that you know that there is a national human trafficking hotline. We at Hub of Hope are directly connected with that hotline. And so also you can see that on your screen. The National Human Trafficking Hotline is 888-373-7888. And so we say call that. Is somebody gonna rush in and immediately just assist? Probably not, but you've done your part. And if you're like me, I love Wonder Woman. So if you're like me, you wish you could just be the hero, right? And just rush in and be able to do something yourself. But it takes a community understanding trafficking, coming together, and being able to actually assist so that we can see the end of trafficking, maybe even in our lifetime. And I do want to say too, if it's in a dangerous situation, if danger is present, we always say call 911 as well. And so these are all opportunities maybe for you to recognize human trafficking right within your circle of influence. And so hopefully that will be helpful to you all, because remember, you are a hero. Just by recognizing a sign and reporting a tip, that's doing so much, and keeping yourself safe as well. So reach out for help. So we've come to that place. You've learned all of these things about trafficking, and you're probably asking, what is it that I could actually do? So I want to talk first of all about the cyclical nature of trafficking and demand. And so we really want to understand that somebody is groomed, brought into trafficking. They are abused, they're manipulated and controlled. They're sold over and over again, whether it be for sex trafficking or labor trafficking, but then they get rescued, and yay for them. But that's going to continue because it's a cycle and because of demand. And so people who buy people are the reason why that nature of trafficking remains cyclical. And so thinking back about the list of things that we just talked about, how you can make a difference, because you're a difference maker. You can first of all stop the demand. So don't buy sex. Think about not watching pornography. Get help with that. Be a conscientious consumer. So very important. And what that means is think about the products that you buy. When we're thinking about labor trafficking, have you ever thought about, where does my cotton shirt come from? Or where does the coffee bean come from that makes my delicious cup of coffee? Or where does that chocolate, that cocoa bean come from when I taste all of that delicious chocolate that I love? That's the 3 C's that I like to make sure that you understand. But there's so many more products. And so just thinking about being a conscientious consumer. We can never get away totally from the issue of slave labor. It's very difficult to do. But I think we could all just really think about, where do our products come from? Also, know all the things you can know about trafficking, know the signs, and know how to report that. Spread the word. At Hub of Hope, we use a hashtag that says awareness fuels rescue. And that is so true. So share with someone today something that you learned. Volunteer locally. Look at the organizations in your area, where you live in your community. Agencies that work with homeless populations, crisis pregnancy centers. Maybe it's an organization that helps women moving from crisis to self-sufficiency. Look at those agencies and lean in and volunteer locally. Keep yourself safe. That's number 6. Keep yourself safe. There's something that you can remember. If you post something, let's say on social media, it is like throwing up a fistful of feathers in the air, and you would see feathers flying everywhere. How many of those feathers do you think that you're going to be able to get back? And so when you post something on social media, that goes out like those feathers in the wind. You're not going to be able to get those back again. And so be so very careful about thinking about posting your name, your age, where you go to school, where you work, where your kids might go to school. So let's be really careful. Think about setting boundaries in what you post on social media and the way that you're utilizing online platforms. And then the last one is your choice of career. So as you're looking at what you're going to be doing the rest of your life, choose a career that could actually help us to end human trafficking, to help rescue individuals, to help bring them to freedom. And the career that you might already be in, think about ways that you could apply something that you learned today in that career of your choice. So remember all of those things. It's important because you are a difference maker.